When you really want to play a new game, waiting for its release can be painful, and some games keep us waiting way longer than others. Take Too Human, for example. We may have just got our hands on this action RPG mishmash of Norse mythology and science fiction, but we've been waiting for almost a decade. Too Human was originally slated for a 1999 release on the PlayStation 1, and was planned to be an epic that spanned 4 discs and countless hours of game time. But then something happened. The game's creators, Silicon Knights, were signed on as an exclusive developer for Nintendo's GameCube. They ended up releasing a frightfully good survival horror game called Eternal Darkness instead, as well as a top-notch remake of Metal Gear Solid for Nintendo's little purple box. But they never did give up on making Too Human. In 2000, Silicon Knights once again revealed the game, now for the GameCube, and looking all the better for it. However, this would be the last we'd ever see of Too Human on a Nintendo console. In 2004, Silicon Knights would split from Nintendo to side with Microsoft and set about working on Too Human for another 4 years, finally releasing it in 2008 on Xbox 360.
Ragnarok.
If there has to be an award given for the longest period between starting development and a release date, though, this game would win it hands down. It's called Saboteur, and it was originally programmed in 1984 for the Atari 2600. Now, if you know your video game history, you'll know that 1984 was a bad year for the games business, and a worse year for Atari. It was the era of the great video game crash, and a cash-strapped Atari just wasn't willing to take a risk on this espionage-themed shooter. Despite being practically complete, the release of Saboteur was sabotaged, with Atari canceling it indefinitely. That is, until 20 years later. In 2004, when Atari released this, the Atari Flashback console, it came with a bonus. The console included a compilation of well-known retro classics like Yar's Revenge and Warlords, but there was one game on the list that hadn't been seen by anyone outside Atari since the mid-80s. Of course, it was Saboteur, and it finally had its first official release on an Atari console after an amazing 2-decade delay. Clocking in at about half that long was this late arrival. It's 3D Realms' Cherokee Indian meets malevolent alien race game, Prey, and it was first announced way back in 1995. Back then, the game didn't look like much, and after stumbling at a few development hurdles, 3D Realms ended up packing it in and starting all over again. Almost a decade later, and the game was finally released. And thankfully, it was fantastic. Mixing a compelling story and characters with some great graphics, cinematic atmosphere, and trigger-pumping action, Prey was worth the wait. Prey even managed to do Portals more than a year before Portal did Portals, although admittedly Portals did do Portals better than Prey's Portals. Next up is the Ukrainian-made Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl. Making a high-profile game in the Ukraine is probably a hard task at the best of times, but when you're attempting to make one of the most ambitious first-person shooters/role-playing games of your generation, you're bound to hit a few snags along the way. Unfortunately for the game's developers, GSC Game World, Stalker hit about 6 years' worth of snags. The game was first announced in 2001, but experienced numerous delays, engine overhauls, and an unfortunate incident that leaked an early version of the game onto the internet. When it finally arrived in 2007, Stalker certainly looked its age, and it had to defend itself from younger, prettier competition like The Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, which was released in the same month. Despite stiff competition, Stalker did pretty well for itself, with its unique post-apocalyptic atmosphere winning it plenty of admirers. And last but certainly not least is this. What list of delayed games would be complete without a mention of 3D Realms' Duke Nukem Forever? A game that's been so long in the making that it really does feel like we've been waiting for it for a long time. The sequel to the original rough and risque first-person shooter started development in 1997, and more than 10 years on it's still going, with no end in sight.
I'm looking for some alien toilet to park my bricks. Who's first?
All we know about the game so far is that it will indeed feature Duke, shooting off both his gun and his mouth in traditional Nukem style, and if the 3D Realms production art is anything to go by, then we're in for a game that doesn't take itself too seriously. That is, of course, if it ever gets finished.
Good day.
Next week, we'll be taking a look at Spore, the latest project by one of the most influential and successful game developers of all time, Will Wright. But before we do that, we think it's time to take a look back at Will's career and works, backwards compatible style. William Wright was born on January 20th, 1960 in Atlanta, USA, to an engineer father and an actress mother. As a child, he was obsessed with learning and immersed himself in books, and he would later keep himself occupied building homemade robots, a hobby that inadvertently led him towards computers.
I was buying computers to attach to my robots and control them, but I still build them to this day. I was competing in BattleBots and Robot Wars and all those things.
After Will discovered computers, he became obsessed with something else. Games. In his early 20s, Will sunk countless hours into games like Bruce Artwick's Flight Simulator and Bill Budge's Pinball Construction Set. But after realizing just how much of his time was eaten up by these games, he decided on a more productive hobby, making his own. The first game was Raid on Bungling Bay, released by Broadband Software in 1984, when Will was just 24 years old. Bungling Bay put you in control of a helicopter and let you loose on a sprawling landscape of buildings, roadways and military bases, with a quest to drop bombs on a few strategically placed factories to put the evil Bungling Empire, the game's villains, out of action. But Bungling Bay would prove even more important because it was the starting point for Will Wright's next project, SimCity. The idea came to Will as he was making Raid on Bungling Bay. He discovered that it was more fun to build the game's complex cities rather than to bomb them to pieces, so he created an entire game based on the concept of urban planning, where players had to build roads, homes, factories, and emergency services, while also managing their city's electricity supplies, crime rates, pollution levels, and more, all to create their own idyllic virtual metropolis. When SimCity came out in 1989, nobody had seen anything like it. It was the first in a genre that would become known as the God Game, because it put you in the role of an omnipresent being, looking down upon the world and recreating it as you saw fit. It also gave you complete freedom of gameplay. You could choose to build an organized city that ran like a well-oiled machine, or if you preferred chaos to order, you could just smash your tiny world to smithereens and watch the rubble burn. Either way, it was all good, clean fun. Needless to say, SimCity was a hit, a big hit. The original game would sell well into the millions and set an impossibly high standard for every simulation game that was to follow. In the early 90s, while the world was still reeling from SimCity's impact, Will expanded the game's concept to two totally opposite ends of the spectrum, with SimEarth and SimAnt. While SimEarth pushed simulation to a planetary scale, SimAnt instead took a magnifying glass to the underground activities of an insect colony. Neither game broke any sales records, and although they did manage to attract sizable cult followings, it was the sequels to SimCity that would really make Will Wright and his company Maxis Software the big name that they are today. Between 1993 and 2007, Will Wright would design 4 more SimCity games, ranging from the isometric simplicity of SimCity 2000 through to the completely realised 3D world of SimCity Societies, with each instalment in the series bringing new challenges, new disasters, and most importantly, new simulations to the familiar Sim formula. Over the years, Will and Maxis Software have made way too many other Sim games to mention, including such varied titles as SimCopter and SimTower. But for now, let's just assume that if you've ever seen a game with the word Sim in its title, there's a good chance that Will Wright had something to do with it. One last Sim game that we really can't avoid mentioning though is this. It's The Sims, and for this, his most successful creation to date, Will Wright had to draw on all of his past experiences in the genre to create a simulation of life itself. In The Sims, you played the typical god figure, although instead of manipulating buildings and roads, you were manipulating people, or Sims as the game called them. Not only did you control your Sims' career, social life, and physical health, but you also had to control when they ate, when they slept, and even when they went to the toilet. They even have their own language, Simlish. It was a risky concept, but it paid off big time. The Sims rapidly became a bestseller, spawning one sequel to date and countless expansions. And while many hardcore gamers are reluctant to admit their affection for the game, the numbers don't lie, with the Sims franchise selling more than 100 million copies worldwide, making it the most popular PC gaming series of all time. With Spore just 1 week away, we'll finally get to see if Will Wright's latest life simulator lives up to its potential. But if his track record so far says anything about this gaming god, we may just be in for the ride of our simulated lives.
For more than 30 years, George Lucas has kept our galaxy enthralled with his science fiction saga of evil galactic empires, hokey religions, and super sweet space-age saber-slashing. Of course, we're talking about Star Wars. The first video game to be set a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away was this. It came out way back in 1982 for the Atari 2600, and even though it was the first Star Wars game ever, it was actually based on the second movie, The Empire Strikes Back. In it, you had to assume the role of a rebel pilot, gunning down Imperial walkers in your snowspeeder on the snow-covered battlefields of Hoth. Not a bad start, but this young Padawan was yet to become a master, and the next step in its Jedi training was this. Star Wars hit the arcade in 1983. Its primitive 3D graphics put you behind the controls of Luke Skywalker's X-Wing spaceship and challenged you to take on an armada of Imperial TIE fighters, and ultimately to make the climactic run through the Death Star Trench, making a pretty explosion as you went. Over the next few years, Star Wars would produce 2 more arcade sequels based on the other 2 films in the trilogy. Both were shooters, although only The Empire Strikes Back would maintain the 3-dimensional look of the first arcade game, with Return of the Jedi opting for a more traditional 2D angle. Meanwhile, on the home console front, Star Wars was just hitting the Nintendo Entertainment System. Both the original film and The Empire Strikes Back were given the platform game treatment, with the young Skywalker this time having to conquer plenty of risky jumps, as well as the Galactic Empire. Unfortunately, these games leaned more towards the dark side than the light side when it came to gameplay, and it would take several years later, until the release of the Super NES, for LucasArts to get that part right. When the Super Star Wars series first arrived in 1992, it pretty much made every Star Wars fan's dreams come true. Here for the first time was a game that authentically replicated the look, feel, and sound of the movies. And on top of all that, the gameplay was more fun than going to Tashi Station to pick up some power converters. On the PC, Star Wars was also making a big impact. In 1993, LucasArts would release some of the greatest space combat games of all time, in the form of the X-Wing and TIE Fighter series. In X-Wing, you played a pure-hearted rebel pilot taking it to the dark side from your cockpit, while TIE Fighter let you dirty your hands on the other side of the Force as an Imperial pilot gunning for rebel blood. The PC would also see several other classic Star Wars games over the next few years, including the Rebel Assault and Dark Forces series, along with about 1 million others. The mid to late 90s was a good time to be a Star Wars fan. The original trilogy was re-released in cinemas, loaded up with all new computer-generated special effects, and the games too were coming in thick and fast. The PlayStation was on the receiving end of this one-on-one fighting game called The Masters of Terrakasi, which promised epic lightsaber battles, but was actually pretty terrible. Thankfully, the Nintendo 64 came to the rescue with the first game in the Rogue Squadron series, a super authentic flight sim shooter that still rates as one of the best Star Wars games ever. But then, in 1999, there began a great disturbance in the Force, like 1 million Star Wars fanboys crying out in unison and suddenly silenced. We speak, of course, of the prequel trilogy, and they were rubbish.
The reading is off the chart.
Midi-chlorians turned the once enigmatic Force into a microbial infection. A future Darth Vader was turned into a romantically inept dweeb, and finally, this jibe-talking space alien blew apart the last remaining credibility like a pair of photon torpedoes to a Death Star exhaust port.
I'm stuck.
Needless to say, these weren't the sequels we were looking for, and nothing short of a Jedi mind trick was going to convince us otherwise. This didn't stop LucasArts from trying to cash in on the mess they'd made, though, and the first game to try it was this. Inspired by the Phantom Menace's most elaborate action scene, Episode 1 Racer put you behind the controls of an anti-gravity chariot and sent you hurtling around the galaxy's most dangerous tracks. And unlike the movie it was based on, this thing was serious fun. However, for every good game, there were a couple of bad ones, like the official tie-in with the Phantom Menace. Gives me chills just thinking about it. Thankfully, the new millennia is where the Star Wars series really started to pick up again. The Rogue Squadron series would continue, with 2 more fantastic sequels on the GameCube. Star Wars Battlefront and Star Wars Galaxies would successfully bring the series into the online multiplayer and MMORPG genres, and most recently the entire saga would be combined with the world's favorite blocky children's toy for the radical reimagination that was LEGO Star Wars. There are, of course, way too many Star Wars games to mention individually, but with The Force Unleashed coming up next week, it's fair to say that the Force will be with us, always.
Before the Wii, before the Game Boy, and even before the NES, Nintendo was already making innovative game machines, just like this one. It's called the Game & Watch, and if you've been playing games for long enough, then the chances are you had your first introduction to the world of Nintendo courtesy of one of these babies. First released in 1980, the Game & Watch was the brainchild of visionary inventor and toy designer Gunpei Yokoi. As legend has it, Yokoi was commuting home from the office by train when he spied a bored businessman passing the time by pressing buttons on an LCD screen calculator. Yokoi combined the concept of an LCD screen and a few buttons with what Nintendo did best, making games. And the Game & Watch was born. And if you're wondering where the watch part of the name comes in, they also included a digital clock. The first model of Game & Watch consoles were these ones, and they were nicknamed the Silver Series because of the colour of their metal faceplates. This particular game is called Fire, and it had you rescuing people as they leapt from the windows of a burning building. You had to use a safety net to bounce them into the back of an ambulance, which of course scored you big points. The technical limitations of early 1980s liquid crystal displays meant that Game & Watch units like Fire had to be extremely simple in design. That little Game & Watch guy couldn't just run around the screen freely, and instead all of his animations were pre-printed into the LCD screen. It may look kind of clunky today, but in 1980 this was about as cutting edge as game technology could get. The next evolution in Game & Watch design was a slight one. Nintendo basically made the screen wider and used a lot of imagination when they named these new models the widescreen series. One of the most fun and best known of these widescreen games was Octopus, a game that had you attempting to loot a chest full of sunken treasure guarded by a giant octopus who wasn't keen on sharing his riches with you. There were plenty of other games in the widescreen format too, including such varied titles as Snoopy's Tennis, based on the comic strip Pooch, and Fire Attack, a game that saw you protecting an American Civil War era fort against a band of fire-starting Indians. The widescreen series would prove popular, and was produced from 1981 into the early 90s. But the most popular of all of the Game & Watch models were these, the multi-screen series. They were appropriately named because they had 2 screens, and the gameplay was spread out over both. The one I'm holding here is Donkey Kong, and it was without doubt the best known and most popular of all the Game & Watch units. The gameplay was based loosely on the arcade game, with a tiny liquid crystal Mario having to leap over barrels thrown at him by the great ape himself, with the ultimate goal being to climb to the highest rung so he could knock Kong off his girder and get the girl. After the launch of the multi-screen Donkey Kong in 1982, sales of Game & Watch units went through the roof. And over the next few years, Nintendo would dabble in a bit of gambling with a multi-screen version of Blackjack, and even made an LCD version of The Legend of Zelda, among many others. After the success of having 2 screens at once, Nintendo moved on to the next logical progression, having 2 players at once. With the release of the Microversus system in 1984, you can now play games like Donkey Kong 3 on the move, only this time you could let a friend join in.
I am a friend. Can I join in?
The screen was a lot wider than any other Game & Watch, and the body of the Microversus units opened up to reveal 2 paddles with retractable cords. It was really a genius piece of design for the early 80s. The actual Microversus games weren't quite as fun as the multi-screen ones, but they did at least give you the satisfaction of being able to pawn your mates like the noobs they were, even when you were away from home.
Hacks!
In recent years, Nintendo have released compilations of Game & Watch games, complete with updated variants in the Game & Watch Gallery series for the Game Boy Advance. Even more recently, the design of the famous multi-screened Game & Watch was used as the basis for the touchscreened DS console, one of the highest-selling consoles of all time. Meanwhile, original Game & Watch units are considered prized possessions by video game collectors and would probably climb over their grandmothers to get their hands on just a few of the treasures we've got here today. And with the interest in these miniature machines enduring for well over 25 years, the Game & Watch is unquestionably one of the most important developments in gaming history.
Good game.
John, what do you think of when I say great Aussie icons?
Oh, that's easy. Vegemite, meat pies, Bondi Beach, the Hills Hoist, Stubbies, Thongs, and of course, Bert Newton.
Well, what about video games?
Bert Newton's in a video game?
Australia has an amazing history of pioneering developers and classic games. From humble beginnings, where a couple of guys working out of their bedrooms could program a hit title, the growth of Australian games development has been phenomenal. While today's massive teams and multi-million-dollar budgets can amaze us with intelligent and innovative games like BioShock and De Blob, did you know it all started decades ago with a text adventure? Hailing from Melbourne, Beam Software is the great-granddaddy of Australian game development. In fact, Jung wasn't even born when Beam released The Hobbit in 1982.
The Hobbit was surprisingly sophisticated for its time. Events happened in real time and other characters such as Gandalf would move around the world independently of the player. It went on to be the first Australian-developed game to sell over 1 million copies.
Beam followed this success with The Way of the Exploding Fist, a pioneer of the one-on-one fighting genre. As the industry embraced 8-bit and 16-bit generations of consoles, Beam continued to produce the goods. Classic games like Super Smash TV, Shadowrun, and MechWarrior for the Super Nintendo are proof of their status as Australia's most prominent developer of the era.
Into the 1990s, Australian developers tended to find more success on the PC. Brisbane's Oren sent shockwaves through the real-time strategy genre in 1997 with Dark Reign. In many ways ahead of its time, Dark Reign featured a realistic line-of-sight system and also introduced waypoints and production queues. The days of mindless tank rushing were thankfully over, and its influence is still being felt in today's best RTS games.
Unit liberated.
At the same time, over in Adelaide, Ratbag Games was working on a spectacular graphics engine that took full advantage of the nascent 3D accelerator video cards. The first game, Power Slide, established Ratbag as experts in the racing genre. After breaking into the American market with the Dirt Track Racing series, Ratbag were bought by Midway, only to be closed down by the publisher a mere 4 months later. In another tragic tale, Oren never managed to repeat the global success of Dark Reign, despite spotting a lucrative niche with their Trains simulation series. Earlier this year, the studio laid off most of its workforce after the failure of its ambitious MMO Fury, claimed to be the most expensive game ever produced in this country.
As a sports-mad country, you would think that Australia would have produced countless games based on our favorite national pastimes. However, Aussie Rules is the only Aussie sport to have made much of an impact, even if the quality of the games themselves were closer to a rushed behind than a soaring six-pointer. Blue Tongue's AFL Finals Fever in the 90s and Transmission Games' more recent AFL Live series may not have been premiership winners, but they proved popular enough at the time.
Of course, no talk of the great Aussie gaming icons would be complete without a nod towards Australia's only homegrown video game mascot.
Clue? It's not this.
Correct. It's Ty the Tasmanian Tiger, Chrome Studios' Outback-themed platformer from 2002. Ty's girlfriend is a dingo named Shazza, and quite frankly, that alone makes this game worthy of its place as a great Aussie icon. Perhaps the best game ever made to feature anal probing is Destroy All Humans, an amusing parody of an alien invasion in which the player is tasked with terrorizing the hapless human population. It was developed by the Twisted Minds at Pandemic Studios in Brisbane. Still in Brisbane, the Creative Assembly are one of the world's finest purveyors of deep, complex strategy games. Medieval 2 took the Total War series to a new level, combining turn-based empire building with thrilling real-time 3D battles, and fans can enjoy even more with the Kingdom's expansion pack,
One of Australia's unsung development heroes is Steve Faulkner from Infinite Interactive. He got his start at SSG, where he created the uber-hardcore strategy of Warlords. Now, though, he's better known as the designer of Puzzle Quest, which is clearly the jewel in his crown.
To Canberra now, we drop in on Irrational Games, now known as 2K Australia. Irrational has forged an enviable reputation amongst PC gamers, thanks to the 1-2 punch of the highly acclaimed Freedom Force and its sequel, Freedom Force vs. the Third Reich. Irrational, in partnership with its sister studio in Boston, USA, went on to produce Tribes, Vengeance, and SWAT 4, again on the PC. But their big breakout hit was, of course, BioShock. One of the most well-regarded games of all time, BioShock's peerless art, narrative, and design exemplifies the incredible talent currently working in the games industry in Australia.
Now let's raise a toast to our great Aussie gaming icons. As the most popular sport on the planet, football has been a perennial fixture on the release schedules of video game publishers for the past 30 years. Over that time, the football genre has utilized every increase in hardware performance to bring gamers closer to a realistic representation of the sport. From implementing the real rules to even featuring the correct number of players on the field, it took console hardware a long time to catch up to gamers' dreams of recreating every aspect of the beautiful game. The early home console football games were far from beautiful. Some, such as the Hockey Soccer dual cartridge for the Magnavox Odyssey, were ugly imitations of the sport, little more than simple variations on Pong, with a handful of players acting as extra Pong bats and obstacles. Through the early and mid-80s, football games on the Atari 2600, Intellivision, and even the NES remained extremely simplistic. Matches were generally 3 or 4-a-side affairs with no fouls, corners, or penalties. In games like Konami's Hyper Soccer, players would swarm around the ball like a typical Saturday morning under-7s game at your local park. And as you can see, the Socceroos wore pink. Endorsements were all the rage even back then, and like today, were often used to mask some extremely average gameplay. Nonetheless, the biggest stars of English and European football were only too happy to have their terrible haircuts adorning the cover of game boxes everywhere, even if their in-game counterparts looked absolutely nothing like them. The first truly great football game was Kickoff, written by lone programmer Dino Dini and released in 1989 for the Amiga and Atari ST. The powerful new hardware allowed Kickoff to feature the full complement of 11 players per team, and also introduced a pitch radar that enabled you to keep track of the action off-screen. Shortly afterwards, the lads from UK outfit Sensible Software released Sensible Soccer, a fast-paced top-down football sim that emphasized a free-flowing passing game. The Kickoff versus Sensible Soccer wars predated the FIFA versus Pro Evo battle of today. Each game had its own devout fanatics, and the rivalry was as passionate as any real footballing local derby. The competition was fierce as both games traded goals with their even more popular sequels, but it was Sensible who eventually got their hands on the cup with Sensible World of Soccer in 1994. A massive accomplishment for its time, Sensible World of Soccer featured dozens of leagues and tournaments from around the world, including all the real players' names, and even boasted a management mode for those who wanted to tweak their tactics and formation to perfection. As the 3D revolution arrived in the mid-90s, developers experimented bringing a new perspective to football games with the likes of iPlay 3D Soccer and Libero Grande. Unsurprisingly, the other FPS, first-person soccer, didn't take off because players could never see enough of the pitch. Instead, the 3D revolution would eventually benefit the current powerhouses of the football game. EA had first ventured into football with FIFA International Soccer in 1993. But it wasn't until FIFA 96 that the series really began to perform. The PlayStation, Saturn, and PC versions saw FIFA transition into a fully 3D match engine, and EA Sports was able to polish the TV-style presentation that we now take for granted. FIFA 98 Road to the World Cup went even further, bringing the now ubiquitous licensed music to the table, including Blur's Song 2 as the main theme. In gameplay terms, FIFA 98 managed to coax its AI routines into implementing the notoriously tricky offside rule, previously a bane of many a football title, which explains why developers had often ignored it altogether. At the same time, Konami had launched 2 series of its own: International Superstar Soccer for the Super Nintendo and N64, and Winning 11 for the PlayStation. International Superstar Soccer was definitely the better game, with the N64's analog stick allowing finer control of your players' close ball skills, but the PlayStation's triumph in the console war meant that Winning 11 would prove the more popular and enduring title. Some games decided not to bother going head-to-head with FIFA and Pro Evo, and are all the better for it. Super Mario Strikers and Sega Soccer Slam eschew realism in favor of comical characters, ridiculous power-ups, and wildly exaggerated ball physics. They're a hell of a lot of fun, especially if you're after a multiplayer party game. Today though, football is all about FIFA and Pro Evo. The EA Sports "It's in the Game" mantra applies to FIFA's devotion to authenticity and the inclusion of every real player, their likenesses, official sponsors, real stadiums, even the correct brand of magic spray used by team doctors. Pro Evo may lack many of FIFA's official licenses, but its supporters are convinced it has always played a more realistic and challenging game of football. In recent times, FIFA has been making great strides, while the last couple of Pro Evos have struggled to come to grips with the new consoles, especially on the PS3 and 360. This year, the title is wide open, but it's clear that the quality of football being played has never been higher.
Okay, Jung, let's get to it. Year by year, game by game. Just what was happening in the 80s?
Well, Bedge, by the beginning of the 80s, the video game industry was already in full swing. Atari was the established leader in the home gaming market with their VCS 2600 console, launching internationally in 1977, with classic games like Combat and Adventure following soon after, while in the arcades, Taito had already released Space Invaders in 1978, one of the most important and popular games of all time. But as big as gaming had already become, the 80s was where the scene really exploded.
Just as the decade was getting started, this came out. It was the first real competition to the Atari 2600, and it was called the Intellivision. Aesthetically speaking, this thing was quintessential 80s. It's got more wood paneling than a hardware shop and more control buttons than a scientific calculator. It did have a technological advantage over the 2600 though, with Intellivision games sporting significantly better graphics.
1980 would also see the release of Namco's Pac-Man, probably the biggest arcade release of the 80s, while Nintendo made their first steps into the gaming hardware arena with the portable Game & Watch series.
1 year later, and Nintendo's great hairy ape was kidnapping Princess Peach for the very first time in the seminal platform game Donkey Kong. It also featured this little guy. At the time, he was known only as Jumpman, but he was destined for bigger things.
The next year would continue to see the industry grow, and some of the most memorable and influential games of all time would be released, including Namco's space shooter Galaga, Konami's amphibian road crossing simulator Frogger, and Midway's ostrich riding Lance-'em-up Joust, and plenty more besides.
82 was also an important year because it saw the release of no less than 4 rival game platforms, including the Sinclair ZX Spectrum, the ColecoVision, the Commodore 64, and Milton Bradley's Vectrex console. Some would prove more successful than others.
Another game to come out in 82 was this one, E.T. the Extraterrestrial. And if you've been watching tonight's show so far, then you'll know how well that one turned out. After a number of high-profile flops like E.T. and an overabundance of terrible games flooding the marketplace, the inevitable happened. The infamous video game crash of 1983. Most North American game companies folded. Consoles were abandoned by their manufacturers, and even the mighty Atari had to concede defeat.
The years after the US market collapse were quiet for console gaming, but home computers continued to grow in popularity, particularly in Europe, where the ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64, and eventually the Amiga would far outclass their competition. Meanwhile, Japan was making their own entries to the home console industry, with both Sega and Nintendo releasing their first machines, the Sega SG-1000 and the Nintendo Family Computer, or Famicom for short, the console that was destined to turn the global game industry's fortunes around.
As the decade moved into its second half, a new era was about to begin. Nintendo's Famicom would be remodeled and renamed the Nintendo Entertainment System for its worldwide release. And the console wasn't alone. It was accompanied by probably the most important game of the 80s.
It was this, Super Mario Bros. And it was so good that it made people forget about how badly the last console generation had ended and got them to pick up the controller once again. In the next year, the success of the NES saw the home console market explode with the creation of some of the best and most memorable games of all time, including Metal Gear, Castlevania, The Legend of Zelda, Mega Man, and way too many more to mention.
By 1987, this had also come out. It's the Sega Master System. With games like Alex Kidd and Miracle World, the Master System was a great competitor to the NES. And although it never caught up to Nintendo's phenomenal sales, it did do particularly well in Europe and Australia.
Gaming on PC was also coming of age, with plenty of games coming to the Microsoft DOS platform. One particular game genre that was popularised on the PC was the graphic adventure game, like Sierra's King's Quest series, or LucasArts' Maniac Mansion, which offered a new kind of narrative-based gameplay that console and arcade games couldn't replicate.
By late 1989, the games industry was moving in a new direction. Nintendo would release the first portable console, the black and white Game Boy, and home computers were just getting the first taste of games like Will Wright's SimCity and Peter Molyneux's Populous.
Meanwhile, the NES and the Master System were just about to be superseded by 16-bit technology. The Sega Mega Drive had already been released in Japan, and the Super Nintendo Entertainment System was just around the corner.
It's impossible for us to cover everything that made gaming in the 80s great. It was a period of great creativity and technological advancements, and it's the decade that gave birth to many of today's favorite game franchises.
And despite the passing of almost 30 years, it's clear to see why many people today consider the 80s to be a golden age in video gaming history.
See if you can guess this game. It takes place in a vast open world rendered in real-time 3D graphics. You can drive cars, fly helicopters, and pilot boats. You can even steal ambulances and tanks. You get various missions to assassinate people or demolish buildings. You can approach these missions however you want.
Easy. That sounds like Grand Theft Auto to me. Well, not GTA 3 because, it didn't have boats or helicopters. Not GTA 4 because you couldn't steal tanks. So, Vice City?
Nope. The game I'm thinking of was released in 1991. Hunter for the Commodore Amiga was a sprawling open-world action game. With gameplay mechanics and a feature set that's very similar to GTA, you might call it one of the very first sandbox games.
It's a funny term that, sandbox. Not least because in Australia we should call it a sand pit. It's one of those gaming terms that gets banded around a lot without ever really being properly defined. With games like Far Cry 2, Saints Row 2, Fallout 3 and Fable 2 currently absorbing us in their vast virtual worlds, it's tempting to label them all as sandbox games. But they're all really quite different. Jung, what do you mean when you say Hunter is a sandbox game?
Well, for me, a sandbox game is a game where the player has a large degree of freedom. It creates an open environment that lets you explore rather than forcing you down a linear path.
You could be talking about Metroid or Castlevania. Super Metroid leaves you alone on an alien planet, never tells you where to go or what to do, you're just left to explore. Castlevania Symphony of the Night is the same. It's up to you to work out how newfound abilities help you progress deeper into the castle. These games don't force you down a linear path.
I'm not really sure they're sandbox games. I mean, sure, you can traverse the areas of the world in a different order, but you can't create anything of your own or come up with your own solutions. In contrast, you can see GTA's sandboxiness in the way you and I completed missions using totally different strategies.
But GTA isn't a pure sandbox, is it? A lot of the missions force you to use certain vehicles or take a certain route or don't let you kill someone until you've reached a certain checkpoint. A true sandbox would let the player choose every aspect in their approach. I'm thinking of a game like Elite where you could just explore space, trading and raiding without ever obeying any mission directed. You just did whatever you wanted.
Sure, you can do whatever you want as long as what you wanted to do is fly a spaceship, but I agree there's a real sense of freedom when exploring a universe of that size.
You could say the same about Just Cause. Of course, Just Cause was all about ignoring the objectives and trying to do crazy things like flying a plane as high as possible then jumping out, or timing how long you could stay airborne while grappling and parasailing between vehicles.
Maybe that's what defines a sandbox, it's still fun to play even when you're ignoring all the objectives. Look at the Elder Scrolls RPG series. In Oblivion, you can happily ignore the main quest and instead decide upon a life in the Thieves Guild. You can play for dozens of hours just collecting alien treasures or harvesting flora for your alchemy business.
But I wouldn't say Oblivion was a pure sandbox game either. It might have had sandboxes within it, but you're still chasing goals. You always have one eye on how far you've progressed. You're not just messing around to see what happens.
Well, I think a sandbox game can still have goals and objectives, and Crackdown, leveling up through finding orbs or simply using your abilities gives a focus to the action. It also provides a great incentive to explore.
I guess I just want to be a bit more strict with my definition of a sandbox. Modern open-world games like Burnout Paradise have reward systems that encourage you to tackle a range of side missions. The game designers are still setting these goals for you, even if they're not the primary goal of completing the game. You can see the difference in Sid Meier's Pirates. Here's a game with no definitive ending, no ultimate goal. But once you're out on the open sea, you can set your own personal goals. It's kind of like Viva Pinata, which is quite literally a sandbox. There's no way to win the game, so you experiment and interact with its life simulation to see what happens.
And I get that exact same experience from GTA, when I'm standing on a skyscraper in Liberty City lobbing grenades onto the road to cause the biggest pileup possible. Then I've jumped into the sandbox within GTA's open world.
So what is a sandbox game? As we've seen, it encompasses anything from a non-linear structure to the ability to create your own narrative, from a wide open environment to simply being able to ignore a set of objectives and make your own fun.
Perhaps the best definition can be derived from the gameplay itself, its free-form nature. The whole point of a sandbox game is to blur the lines between what we think of as strict genre boundaries, constantly change and evolve based on what the player wants to do. We can't define it, but we can create something and play with it endlessly.
These days, Epic Games are best known for their fast-fragging, curb-stomping, blockbusting action games. But there was a time when this game developer was known for something else: shareware. Epic Mega Games, as they were originally called, got their start in 1991 with this. It was called ZZT, and it was an action-adventure game designed and programmed entirely by the company's founder, Tim Sweeney. This was before the days of digital distribution, so ZZT was sold as shareware, with the game's first level coming for free, while the rest of the game was available to purchase by mail order. After getting a few checks in the mail, Epic Mega Games had enough capital to invest in a second game. That game was Jill of the Jungle, and it was a platform game, one of the most popular shareware genres of the time. And although Jill wasn't quite as fun as id Software's Commander Keen or Apogee Software's Duke Nukem, for example, having a half-naked Amazonian superwoman as its main character must have done something for it, because the mail orders came in by the bagful. The year after Jill of the Jungle's release was also important for Epic, as it was the year that a young game designer named Cliff Blazinski would join the company.
I was just a kid sitting in my mom's house in California, and I was programming my own games. I was a horrible artist and I was a horrible programmer, but I wasn't going to let that stop me. I managed to make my own title, put it in an envelope, sent it off to Epic over in Maryland, and I got a phone call from Mark Rain, and I decided that I'd partner with these guys to publish the games that I was at that point producing.
Blazinski's first game for Epic would be Dare to Dream, a point-and-click adventure game that took you inside an imaginary world of a 10-year-old boy. But it would be his next game that would really put Epic Mega Games into the big league. That game was Jazz Jackrabbit, a fast and colourful platformer that was heavily inspired by Sega's Sonic the Hedgehog.
They hooked me up with a program named Arjan Brissi, who had an engine that kind of felt like the game he was building felt kind of like Turrican, which was an old Amiga game. And then I was like, I just kind of want to make a game with a green rabbit in it. And I was always a big fan of Sonic and Mario and those types of titles, but also wanted to make something that was just kind of like a Rambo rabbit, you know, just a little green bunny that kicked ass with a big gun. And just kind of drew it myself, put it in the game, and worked on it for about a year and a half, 2 years, and actually released that title right when I was finishing up high school.
When Jazz Jackrabbit arrived in 1993, it was the closest thing that PC gamers had to a genuine console platformer. Over the next few years, the Jazz series grew to include a number of Christmas-themed expansion packs, as well as a proper sequel, which introduced the world to Jazz's politically incorrect cousin, Spaz Jackrabbit. Epic had plenty of other hit games, of course, with games like Extreme Pinball, space shooters like Solar Winds, or adventure platform games like Zargon, just to name a few. But by the mid to late 90s, the popularity of shareware games was on the decline. PC gamers had moved on to a new generation of 3D first-person shooters, And Epic needed a game that could compete with the likes of Quake and Half-Life. That game was Unreal. With one of the most advanced 3D graphics engines of its era, an exciting space opera storyline, and rock-solid shooting action, Unreal was one of the biggest PC game releases of 1998.
Unreal was set out originally to be kind of a more of an exploratory game in some ways, more so than a shooter. Back in that day, the kind of games that were popular were your Dooms and your Quakes, where it was very brown, dark, scary corridors with, rocket launchers. And we wanted to make a world that felt vast and a world that felt mysterious, where the player could, at his leisure, go through this very large area and explore this alien church or find a wrecked alien spaceship. And we were very much young, bullheaded designers building whatever the hell we wanted to, and we were somehow able to kind of pull that together into a cohesive universe and make a game that many gamers see as a classic.
The response to Unreal was good, so good in fact that Epic Mega Games decided to celebrate, firstly by getting rid of their Mega by changing their name to just Epic Games, and secondly by releasing a truckload of Unreal sequels. As we all know, Unreal went on to spawn one single-player sequel and no less than 6 multiplayer sequels in the form of the Unreal Tournament series, which is still one of the leading competitive FPS games today. By 2006, Epic were one of the leading PC game developers, but they hadn't had much of an impact on home consoles. All that changed with Gears of War. With Gears, Epic combined ultra-violent steroid junkies with chainsaw guns and a post-apocalyptic wasteland filled with butt-ugly aliens. A winning combination if there ever was one. Next week, we'll finally get to see how Epic's 17-year history has influenced their latest game, Gears of War 2. But until then, I'm getting back to my half-naked Amazonian.